Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 26th of July. We have some really important developments beginning with Krasnohorivka, then looking at the Pokrovsk Direction and finishing off with Pishchane. I'm going to zoom in with Krasnohorivka first, and today's video will be a bit shorter compared to others, but in my arsenal I'm planning a lot of detailed, intricate, and informative videos for the next month or so, with again a particular emphasis on unit composition and elevation, which I've really carved out as a niche. I forgot to mark the Russian advance here in Krasnohorivka with a yellow color, but I'm going to be doing that from now on. And you can see the Russians were able to advance here about 120 meters northwards. I'll mark the actual advance using this red perimeter. What's important to note is that we know this based on a Ukrainian video of a compilation of various drone drops where they, of course, released the grenades onto houses where you have Russian soldiers just acting as a vanguard and just pushing forward. This time they were able to pass the Nakhimova sort of horizontal, then it becomes sort of slanted over here road, but it is a very important metric to see where the Russians are currently positioned at, because this is a road where for a while, when I say a while, we're talking about maybe a week or so, you did have a strong Ukrainian presence trying to hold on and repel any sort of further Russian forays into the northernmost sections of this northwestern corner of Krasnohorivka. And so there were some difficult battles here between both sides, and the Ukrainians do still hold on to this sort of extreme northwestern corner over here where the Nakhimova road still acts as a dividing line. But now you see the Russians have been able to crack the Ukrainian defense in this particular region and infiltrate deeper, which again will give them the opportunity to finally solidify control over a lot of the gray zone over here. A lot of these regions are just so difficult to occupy because you step out of a certain protected area like a basement, and there are a lot of Ukrainian drone crews. That's the majority of their operations on a daily basis here, just trying to spot Russian soldiers walking out and about and then trying to pick them off. And that's what causes slower advances. It's also why the Russians just go hopping house from house, and that's what we use as a metric for the advance. But yeah, if you look at the bigger picture, it means the Russian forces really are inching closer to just completely securing this section of Krasnohorivka. And then when you look north and in the western direction, there are still Ukrainian holdings in this region that are not necessarily vertically significant, but in terms of their horizontal width, like you look at them, some of them span like 5 kilometers in terms of the houses and the roads over here. And so it is a rather large area that still has to be cleared out, and those are now acting as some of Ukraine's organizational structures for some of their forward companies and platoons operating over here. Most notably, you do have the 117th Brigade, a territorial defense unit. Recently, it's been increasing its presence in this part of the front line, and a lot of their drone crews have been involved in the recent footage that I've seen released from Krasnohorivka. Same thing with 80th Brigade. They're heavily involved with the defense over here. I'd assume that a lot of the house fighting where you have soldiers just trying to pin down the Russian advancers, it's being done by this specific units. And so they're just trying to drag their feet and buy more time as they try to solidify control within these northern sections just to the north of the Lozova River. Now looking at Yasnobrodivka, I've reported about Russian infiltrations into the southern portion of this hamlet twice. One time was about a month and a half ago, and then the other incident was around a week or two ago. And what this shows us is that there's a very volatile nature to the front over here, which is understandable because there aren't a lot of permanent positions here for either side to really set camp in. Even Yasnobrodivka itself is an extremely small settlement with very few houses or areas that are now actually intact. Most of it is just ruins after, of course, so many artillery and FPV barrages. And nearby, the closest settlement is Natalove to the south, where you do have a large Russian organization structure. But then northwards, it's all just fields and a few trenches along this vertical road to Omanske. And so it does make sense that there would be attempts by the Russians during this month and a half period with vehicles. They may be able to get a foothold. That's what we reported based on geolocations coming from the Ukrainian side. And then, of course, if there isn't conclusive evidence after a while that the Russians are still holding on to it, then it would be logical to say the Ukrainians eventually repelled them. And so now it's the third time that we're seeing a successful Russian entry into Yasnobrodivka. And this time it's not just vehicular assaults that make it into the Manishin region, because there's just a large Manishin in the southern tip of Yasnobrodivka. And then at that point get targeted by Ukrainian drones. We actually see Russian soldiers standing on the ground. And this is from July 26th. I think it was 2 Russian soldiers in this video just displaying the Russian flag for an overhead view. And you could see just the extent of the damage caused to whatever few structures are over here. And so now most of the settled region of Yasnobrodivka is finally confirmed to be under Russian control. I don't even have a yellow coloring for it because I previously had this region under Russian control, but you could assume that the Russians, had they not been in control over here previously, would have advanced about 1 kilometer northwards. And this time, I think that there's a good reason why the Russians were able to actually succeed in their break-in attempt. It's because of all the other events surrounding the Pokrovsk Direction. They have caused so much volatility for the Ukrainians, a lot of units being moved around, a lot of artillery and drone crews being redirected to try to hold the line in an area like Novoselivka or northwards, more importantly. And so Yasnobrodivka was just sort of forgotten in the backdrop of all of that. You probably did have some sort of composition of some small squads from the 56th Brigade, but even them, I haven't seen that active, and when I have, it's more so from Karlivka. And so there was always just a very small garrison left in Yasnobrodivka, always very exposed from hills to the east and just from flanking from villages nearby. And so it's not too surprising that now the Russians are finally getting a stab at Yasnobrodivka and are trying to take it over to its fullest extent, following the Ukrainians now beginning to continue with their drawback west of the Vovcha River. Okay, now looking at what I would refer to as the rail line axis, because you could see how the Russians really are centering their advances along this rail embankment. It's no surprise why, but I'll rehash it again. It's just so good to use whatever dugouts and whatever windbreaks are parallel to the rail line as concealment and also cover for whatever Russian soldiers are advancing here, depending on their sizes, which in some cases could be relatively large, in the dozens, according to Deep State, for instance. That allows them to advance through this region with more relative safety and do so along an area that not only is accompanied by a paved road, so that's important for vehicles, but is also on an embankment, which overlooks nearby Ukrainian fields, defenses, and villages. And so that's the rationale. It also now provides the Russians with a lot of flanking options, looking southwards, for instance. But just to get an idea of the extent of the Russian advances, you can see in yellow, these are the gains from the past 2 days. Soon I'm going to turn all of this into the same color as the color over here to the east, so you guys can see a daily change in the composition of where Russia is actually in control. But for now, what you'll see based on my measuring stick is that the Russian forces were able to advance approximately 1.3 kilometers southwestwards. You could see that they are really not too concerned about any sort of Ukrainian presence on these fields here, just because it is so depleted at this point. It's totally unsafe for any large organization of Ukrainian soldiers to be there and threaten Russian flanks. So whatever Ukrainian troops really are at ground zero are a bit further southwards at some of these strong points set up just west of the river and also around Zhelane, which is now being overlooked by the current Russian vector of advance. And if they are to continue advancing along the rail line, then the rail line portion that's under Ukrainian control right now, just west of the village, will just completely dominate it. And that's going to make it extremely difficult, both from a flanking perspective, but also from an elevation perspective, to hold on to this village. Now, looking at other Russian advances, they were able to push through several tree lines in order to begin DRG operations into nearby villages like Vesele. Russians advanced here 700 meters. And Vesele is just an extremely small hamlet. Let's see how much it spans. It spans about 1.7 kilometers. And so there is a Ukrainian defense here because a lot of the units that were holding around just eastwards Vovcha, Pokrovsk, and northwards Lozhvatska, they've organized around here and Ivanivka. But it is a sort of haphazard organization because the Russian advance has occurred so quickly. And so I don't know how cohesive it is. I don't even know which defenses they're going to rely upon because You can see that there's really only two here, and they're between Vesele and Ivanivka. And also, Vesele is basically an extension of this low-lying valley, which is just completely unfavorable for the defender when compared to the immediate surroundings to the east where the Russians are located. And so there is a big worry that Vesele could be compromised, and at that point, the Russians would have very, very strong access to this horizontal road that initially ran parallel to the rail line, and at that point, it reaches all the way to Hordivka, which I do think the Russians are looking at, even though the rail line access is so important for them. There's a massive opportunity right now to undermine the broader Ukrainian logistics and broader defense that we're looking at, not just like in the immediate line of contact, but going 10, 20 kilometers westwards. There's a big chance of that being compromised with the Russians being able to reach an area like Hordivka this quickly, which the Ukrainians definitely did not expect. And so for now, Vovcha, Ukrainian sources claim there's fighting going on in the southern farms still, but they're admitting that for the most part, besides also some fighting in these northwestern portions here with some residential areas, they are admitting that for the most part, the Russians have taken over the entirety of Vovcha, and so no real updates in terms of territorial control. We have some footage from the past few days showing how the Ukrainians did try to organize a defense in Vovcha following the fall of Pokrovsk, which occurred it occurred 6 days ago by now, nearly 6 days. And so the Ukrainians, they had a couple of days to organize defenses here. The 47th Brigade sent in its Abrams because, Abrams are not that widely used anymore in terms of obviously scarcity and trying to preserve whatever they have left. But in critical situations like this, they have been moved in the past, and it's an indication that the situation deteriorated so much that they were reintroduced to the fighting. And so in the span of these few days where the Ukrainians were still in control of Vovcha, they sent in armored assets like Bradleys, but as I said before, tanks, and the Russians spotted them. Their drone crews were very active around here, and in this case, they actually fixed artillery strikes, and the Russian 155 millimeter cross-the-pole guided shell actually hit the Abrams tank as it was trying to protect one of these trenches, trying to protect a strong point for the Ukrainians to just drag and buy time. And as we said before, it was corrected by an Orlan 30 reconnaissance drone, and so that one was probably damaged or destroyed, and I don't know how the Ukrainians would even get it out if it wasn't fully destroyed. Here's an older one from July 7th, but there's also here video from July 25th of Russian FPV hitting a tank southwest of Vovcha. I don't think it's an Abrams, but there was another Abrams that it wasn't explicitly geolocated, but it was generally around the region north of Novoselivka Parish, I believe, where there was Abrams located, and it was also either damaged or destroyed by the Russian side. And so we're just getting inundated with these sort of damages, increase in equipment damages for the Ukrainians because they very rapidly increased their amount of armored assets to try to buy a little bit of time and to try to deplete the Russian offensive capacity. Now, regardless of what's happening westwards with Hordivka, the Russian advance amounting to about 1.2 kilometers northwards to Ivanivka is also very concerning. Ivanivka is an extension of this Torets River valley, and so this is also a low-lying area. The Ukrainians don't really control any more heights in this region. I suppose that this field just west of Ivanivka is slightly on a higher elevation, but the Russians are on track to capture it in these next few days. The only other nearby region where you do have significant Ukrainian heights is actually in this region between Timofivka and Vozdvizhenka, which I guess these two parallel red lines, they basically run to the ring road and they run to the highway. And so those are the areas where Ukrainians are probably going to move in mortars and some sort of, reconnaissance assets, try to salvage whatever they do still have at their disposal to improve the frontline conditions. And so look out for Ivanivka, because the fall of Ivanivka, not only does it embolden the Russians to Hordivka, but it emboldens the Russians to just completely undermine this chain of villages from Timofivka to all the way to the west over here to villages that we didn't even know of beforehand. But these villages are all going to become active parts of the front line with the fall of an Ivanivka, for instance. And so it's going to just play a lot into degrading Ukraine's rear integrity at this point. But let's zoom in for a second and look at what's going on with this pocket between Lozhevatske and Pokrovsk. Finally, Ukrainian sources, whether it be Petrenko or Deep State, have admitted that the Russians are in full control of this, what was previously considered to be Ukrainian pocket held by the 31st Mechanized Brigade. And so it is a rather large region that we're talking about. If I'm going to measure it out for you guys, something in the ballpark of 2 square kilometers, where for at least 2 days, you could say, there was a legitimate concern, according to Ukrainian sources, that elements of 2 battalions of the 31st Mechanized Brigade were going to be completely surrounded and then, of course, eviscerated. What's being claimed by Deep State is that following heavy coordination between the 31st Brigade and outside units, they were able to maintain a very narrow escape corridor, which you could see marked here with my marker here, measuring stick, 600-meter corridor, utilizing, of course, drones and then also armored vehicles being moved in by the Ukrainians to try to free them. And the claim by the Ukrainians is that the vast majority of the defenders that were stuck in here due to the refusal of retreat orders, withdrawal orders by the upper command of the brigade, were able to make it out, are now holding somewhere else along the Torets River. Now, I was waiting for the Russian side to give their version of events, and we don't have a full narrative from the Russians, but they did release some very interesting footage, which is not actually from July 26th. The actual events probably occurred a day or two ago, and it's a compilation of how the Russian forces were able to deal with a specific strong point that the Ukrainians were holding on to. I don't have the exact geolocation for the strong point because this geolocation shows just a specific Russian or Ukrainian Max Pro being hit by, I believe, a grenade launcher and then by FPVs. And so that's the geolocation that you see with this blue marker. But the Ukrainian stronghold in question is probably within this pocket over here. Maybe it's this trench system. But we do know that there were some defenses, including with the tree lines along the hill of the Ukrainians were holding onto in this pocket. And so what this Russian source is claiming is basically they were able to divert the attention of the Ukrainian defenders by conducting a diversionary assault with one group that was attacking over here. And then at that point, they conducted a more legitimate assault that was head-on and direct, using vehicles and infantry, and were able to actually head-on assault the strong points, dismount, enter into the trenches, and then one by one begin to clear them out. And in that specific process, they were able to capture at least 7 Ukrainian soldiers, and they were caught on film. So I know that they were actually taken POW in this engagement. And so the Ukrainians did plan and had pretty well-built defenses in the region, but the Russian infantry were able to storm them, and they were able to take out some vehicles that the Ukrainians sent to try to relieve the Ukrainian defenders that were holding here, including a T-64 and the Max Pro that I mentioned before. And so that's probably what Deep State was alluding to when they said that the outside units, like the rest of the 31st Brigade or the 110th Brigade, sent in their own assets to help relieve the besieged force. But it appears that that relief force also incurred casualties, and that not all of the elements that were besieged over here actually made it out. At the very least, 7 surrendered, but it could be even higher depending on the other strong points in this height that were taken over by the Russians. Now, looking forward, the Russian forces have a very strong base along this height south of Lozhuvatske, which will allow them to overlook the Torets River Valley. As we said, in immediate danger is Lysychny, where the Russian forces have now advanced, for instance, here about 800 meters westwards. So they're getting close to the vertical road over here, and actually crossed over the road at this particular point, which they were able to amass a gain of 600 meters westwards here. And so they're very close to Lysychny, which is an extremely small village. It's also less connected to the chain of villages than Timofivka and the other ones that are directly next to the ponds over here. And so it is going to be just heavily exposed based on roads that are located here. And also when you look at this vertical road, the Russians finally have control of a road that directly leads to the ring point, the ring road, that then, if you go westward, connects to Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk. And so the Russian forces are beginning to get control over certain logistic points, logistics chokeholds that in the future will be utilized to expand the front line and then actually get control over more important assets. And so at the moment, Timofivka is being flanked from the south, and that has implications even further for other villages around here, whether they be around Touretsk or whether they be northwards along this village, Vovcha, or along the chain of villages on a lower elevation like Baranivka. The list really does go on. There are a lot of possibilities that, a lot of holes, and there's a lot of possibilities for the Russians to exploit them based on this just continued Russian push occurring along the rail line axis. And we could see this with the 31st Brigade of the Russian forces, or the Ukrainian forces. We talked about the 31st Brigade today. Clearly, they're not completely depleted of strength. They're actually now going to be the main unit responsible for defending in the region between Timofivka and Lysychne. And so they released this compilation July 26th of 7 FPV strikes onto Russian infantry, houses where the Russians were occupying, and Desert Cross, I should add the R, 1,003 ATVs. And so those ATVs, of course, they're used for quick mobility, and so I get why they're advancing in fast pace along the rail line, trying to reach an area like Pokrovsk. And so now the 31st Brigade, their drone crews are trying to target as many of those Russian soldiers from the companies operating in Pokrovsk as possible to try to diminish their offensive force and make it harder for large Russian groups to begin congregating here, because Pokrovsk really could become a forward operating node that acts as a conduit between Ocheretina and then the area west of the Vovcha River. And finally, moving on to Pishchane, I really should have talked about it in yesterday's video, but I just got distracted by the more significant events unfolding around Pokrovsk and so on. And so I didn't actually add in the yellow marker here, but from now on, from this video onwards, every single Russian advance and vice versa Ukrainian gain will be marked with a specific color to distinguish between what was previously taken over. And so at Pishchane, what we now know is that the Russian forces have been able to advance about 800 meters, 900 meters westwards. They've been able to gain control over additional fields, additional warehouses, and just generally residential regions on the northern outskirts of this sort of vertical village. And so I'm just marking with these rectangle shapes and quadrilaterals all the locations that the Russians have now secured. They really have been, over the past few days, involved in just clearing out whatever pockets remain, any sort of region where there may be a Ukrainian presence or a high amount of Ukrainian fire concentrated towards that region. The Russians trying to secure those areas. And now the next goal would be to secure these various tree lines, these really large tree lines that are pretty intricate in their size, and then connect to these trenches that you see over here. It will be important for the Russians to neuter any sort of Ukrainian presence here, because it could pose a threat to whatever Russian forces are operating in this rather narrow salient, and it would just always be a thorn in their back. So getting rid of a Ukrainian presence here, and also one generally west of Tabaivka, would act as a really big key that would open up the entirety of this really large swath of land in between Tabaivka, Pishchane, and the Oskil River line. And this area is just lacking in density when it comes to trenches or units for that matter. And so the Russians really do have a huge opportunity here, if the Ukrainians don't send in reinforcements to this northern flank, to begin exploiting the height which I marked within this red perimeter. And at that point, it would have massive implications for the Oskil River line, for various villages that you see me going over right now with the cursor, that are close to the river and are also on the southern flank of Kupiansk. And so that's all that for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.